Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So I saw a fascinating report last week about a report that the United Way came out with, the United Way of Toronto, on social capital in Toronto and in Peel. And it's really quite interesting because what it says is that there is high social capital, but in some areas and not in all areas. And as some of you may know, I've been really interested in social capital. I've been very involved in lots of different things in the community, and think that social capital actually is one of the keys to success, both to make a community great as well as, frankly, in business. And so I wanted to check in with the president and CEO of the Toronto or the Greater Toronto Area United Way. His name is Daniel Zanatti, and he was previously, I understand, head of the United Way in York Region and has taken over in Toronto. And Isabella Cascanti, who is the Director of Research and I presume was very involved in the report. As well, we're joined by Dina Dora, who is the Manager of Media and Communications for United Way. So welcome, everyone, to my show. How are you all?
Great to be here, Brian.
So maybe I could start with you, Danielle. Tell us a little bit about the report, its findings, and why the United Way of Toronto felt it was important to study something as sort of esoteric as social capital.
Nothing esoteric about social capital, friend. As you said, it is the connective glue that brings communities together, but it's often unspoken or invisible. So we talk a lot about financial capital, how much we might have in the bank, how much access we might have to loans, but we often don't talk about its social counterpart, social capital, the access we have to our communities and the resources to scale up our social mobility ladder. And so it's things like how many neighbors you might know in your community, who you're comfortable knocking on their door if there's a crisis and you're in need of assistance, how many associations or clubs you might belong to, whether you volunteer locally or in the region, and your sense of connection and belonging. Because all of the research says that connected communities, those that have strong social capital, also have higher GDP, higher educational achievement, higher employment rates, lower access to social services. And connected communities do better to respond to crisis and emerge from crisis faster. And so we at United Way, under Isabel's leadership, wanted to get a baseline of what did social capital look like in York Region and in your very own Peel Region.
And Isabel, what did you find?
Well, we found that social capital in the region is quite strong. People have the family and friend connections that they need. They're happy with the amount of connections that they have in general. People know where to go when they need some support. People are engaging in the community, and that might be in the clubs that Daniele mentioned, or other community groups. And so in general, we found that social capital across Peel Region is strong. However, an important learning or key finding from the report is that it is not equally distributed. And so we know that those with lower incomes and with less financial security do not have the same access to social capital. And so they don't have the same feeling that their community is safe and that they have the access to the supports that they need. And so that's an important learning for us to really inform our focus and our next steps as well.
One of the preeminent books on social capital was Robert Putnam's Bowling Alone in America, and it really tracked a massive decline in social capital over a century, frankly. Now, I know that your report was static. It was just now, but what's your sense, Isabel? Is social capital in Peel and in Toronto and in York something that is good relative to the past, or is it a lot lower than relative to the past?
Our report is really just one point in time. It offers us that baseline look at social capital. So I won't comment on the past and the changes, but I will comment on the strength of social capital right now. And again, I should say the report was a pre-pandemic look, and that has helped the region and the communities really deal with the pandemic and emerge from the pandemic. One of the really great, I think, hopeful findings in the report is that almost 90% of respondents felt that they had agency to make change in their communities. And so they felt that they could do something to change in their community. And so I think that really talks to that kind of concept of collective work and people working together to bring about positive change and positive work and positive relationships.
That's shocking. 90% think they can make change. Like that's, the vast majority of people I've ever met at the door campaigning and canvassing and things like that think they've got no role in civic government and don't even know who their elected member is municipally rather than provincially or federally. I'm shocked that 90% think they actually have agency to make change.
It's optimistic. It's hopeful. It gives us a sense that we can build on the existing social capital, the bonds that exist, and we could bridge social capital into specific communities. And I think we spoke earlier, Brian, about social capital is a key ingredient in responding to crisis faster and emerging from crisis stronger. And we saw in COVID the ability of Peel residents to mobilize. If we look at the GTA COVID hotspot map, and we look particularly at Brampton, what resonated in Brampton was, in addition to government support or agencies getting involved, it was local trust. Hiring through a network of our local agencies, whether it was Punjabi Community Health Center or Indus, hiring local residents to knock on doors in neighborhoods across Peel, talk to their neighbors about going to a vaccine clinic and getting them out, sharing information in languages and communities that they were comfortable with. And so if we can harness this bridging social capital that we've seen in COVID, and we could build it intentionally through individuals, agencies, and government, we've got a real opportunity to see over time, does this baseline portrait of Peel change? Can we build stronger social capital for those that are living in poverty or experiencing financial insecurity?
We're chatting tonight with people from the United Way of Toronto about social capital, and a study they did of social capital in York, Toronto, and Peel. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back in just a minute. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio, our Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about social capital, something that maybe some of you don't know a lot about. And we're chatting with Danielle Zanatti, who is the president and CEO of the Toronto Region Board of Trade, Isabel Cascanti, who is the director of research, and Dina Dorara, who is the manager of media and communications. Maybe could Isabel or Danielle just sort of give me an overview? Let's take a step back. Lots of people, Danielle, I think you mentioned, know about financial capital. And then one of the things that people have talked a lot about in the last little while is human capital, which I presume is the people and what skills and education and things like that. What is social capital? Do you have a definition of social capital?
Yeah, social capital is essentially the vibrancy of social networks and the extent to which individuals and communities trust one another, rely upon one another, their neighbors, their institutions, and how involved people are in their neighborhoods. That's really the kind of core definition of social capital. A couple more comments. Social capital has been referred to by some as our quote unquote social DNA. It's really the foundation upon which our thriving communities are built. And to your point, we understand, most people understand what capital is. It's that monetary transaction. It has physical value. Social capital is a little bit more intangible in that sense. You can't touch it necessarily, but you can certainly feel it around you and the strength of it. And it is really the focus on those social relationships. The concept of reciprocity is really core and fundamental to social capital. And it's simply that we help our neighbors, we help one another. I'll help you out with something today. And I know that down the road, when I may be in need of support, you or somebody else in the community will come and support me as well.
Danielle, you were speaking about recovery or resilience from the pandemic. And one of the most famous studies of social capital was done in Italy. And they compared Northern Italy to Southern Italy. And they said that in Northern Italy, people had bridging social capital. So they had relationships with other people in their community. And in Southern Italy, they had what they described as bonding social capital, which was a relationship only with people that were part of their family or part of their very tight group. And so what it said was that blood donor clinic participation and club participation and recovering from an emergency was far stronger in the North because people worried about their community, but far less in the South because only people worried about their family. I wonder, did you understand the difference between, are we worried about our whole community or only worried about ourselves in Peel, York, and Toronto?
We are called United Way, Brian, because we are worried about all, and we believe that we really are in this in a united way, and that we talk about this in COVID. I can only be healthy if you are healthy and the community is healthy. But your brilliant reference to both the bonding capital, which is very powerful and critical, but the bridging, which is in fact what holds us together, this connective tissue. Putnam talks about it in Bowling Alone. Malcolm Gladwell talks about it in his references in Roseto, this little town in Roseto, where they couldn't find why people were living longer. Well, because they had this bridging social capital. What I think this report speaks to, and the findings, Brian, in Peel, are very consistent with the findings in York and in Toronto, that social capital, as Isabel said, is not equally distributed. So we must be intentional now in bridging capital with communities who are experiencing poverty, intentionally creating opportunities to meet neighbors in those communities, to volunteer, to build social infrastructure. This is why United Way uses research like this to invest in agencies and networks in those neighborhoods. We must be precise. We must also ask our agencies to use this and be intentional in where they provide services. And then our municipal governments, Peel as a region, and then the city of Mississauga, the city of Brampton, and the town of Caledon, to be intentional about where does social capital exist, where is it strong, and how can we intentionally bridge some of that into those neighborhoods where it doesn't exist.
You know, it's interesting, the article that at least I saw that reported on this study tracked a lady from Mississauga that was very involved in the Chinese community and a whole bunch of the interactions that she had on an ongoing basis. And I was, I don't know if you know this, but I was co-founder and co-chair of something called the Mississauga City Summit, along with Shelley White, the former CEO of the United Way in Peel. It was a great honor and an incredible experience. But one of the things that we found when we were doing the study at the time, or some of the studies at the time of the Mississauga Summit, is that people had great social capital within their ethnic communities, but not necessarily great social capital within the wider community. And one of the challenges that we had was getting people from the Chinese Professional Business Association to talk to the people in the Muslim groups, to talk to the people in the Chinese groups, to talk to people in the regular Canadian groups, and the Italian groups, and the Turkish groups, and the Egyptian groups, etc. What's your sense? Are we in ethnic silos in Peel and York, or have we bridged those silos?
Isabel, any comment before I jump in?
Yeah, I'll say that one of the data points we looked at in the report was around, as you say, the bridging and bonding social capital. And there are more people in the region whose networks are of the bridging type. So the question in the report was specifically around if they shared the same language. And so we know, that's one data point, but we know in the report, as it's detailed there, that the bridging social capital in that sense, people have more connections with people who speak a different language or who might not share the same mother tongue as they do. than others.
I think, though, to your comment, Brian, and I recall the summit well, and I think back then it identified and then acted as a catalyst for the very question you're asking, which is 5 years hence, 10 years hence, we'll want to be tracking, have we built social capital across cultural groups? Have we built it across Peel? Because we know, and research demonstrates, that when people first move into a community, their networks are usually that concentric circle of either their postal code or their immediate ethnic, faith, or cultural community. The success will be whether over time, our next report shows a shift in that baseline. And have we been able to intentionally move towards a much more bridged social capital?
How do you build social capital?
I think, we talk about a few different ways, and quite simply, it must begin with each of the listeners of this podcast or the viewers taking your own individual agency to volunteer. And if you are already, add one more, because as the research says, it actually keeps you living longer and it's good for your health. So volunteer, join an association or a club, get involved civically in your community. Political, as you mentioned, planning issues that are happening in your neighborhood. All of this requires individual agency. For United Way and intermediaries like ourselves, how do we use this baseline data to now be more precise in our funding decisions, in the organizations we partner with, and those we bring to the table intentionally whose voice is not there? Because part of building social capital is inviting different and new voices to existing tables. And then for government, I think to also be intentional about how they begin with voices of people with lived experience. How do they bring them into planning processes? How do they bring them into economic development? How do they bring them into safety issues? As we talk about community safety in Peel, are we listening to the voices in specific neighborhoods? So everyone from individual right through to government can play a role in what we hope is an equitable recovery for all.
So getting involved, you'll live longer. Listening, that governments have got to really be catalysts to this process. But a lot of people just don't want to get involved. And I think with COVID-19, a lot of people have been happy staying at home, working at home, watching their electronic media, etc. How do we build back stronger? How do we get people out of their comfort of their homes and connecting with the community, particularly with people of other ethnic or cultural or religious groups when they've spent the last year and a half isolated?
We may have, Isabel, I'll pass it over to you, but we may have pent up desire for people to actually get out and get involved. So we should really try to take this as an opportunity. But COVID has also shown, Brian, for all of people's desire to be internal, we have seen at United Way an outpouring of generosity of people who want to give their time, talent, or financial resources. And I think we've seen that across our network of agencies, of people who now see this neighborhood can only be as good as all of us. We are in this together. And so I think we have to be intentional about how we engage people, giving them easy entry points to volunteer, giving them easy ways to mix and bump into each other, and then to do another pulse check in a few years to see, are we moving the needle? But it's got to be a collective approach with business, labor, government, and residents all working on this together. Isabel, sorry, I might have jumped in.
No, not at all. I would add to that while we've been physically distanced during the pandemic, we've not been socially distanced. And in fact, the social connections in some cases have been stronger or have been needed more so than pre-pandemic. And so it's been a challenge because of the physical distancing. And in fact, in the early stages of the pandemic, that was the language that was being used, was we need to social distance. And that changed to physical distance because very early on, we really came to realize how important those social connections remained, even though we were in conversations like this one, looking at one another on screen.
I have to agree with you that I think that the social distancing verbiage initially was completely wrong, and I agree with you that some people changed to physical distancing, but a lot of people didn't, and people did stay socially distant. And I want to challenge you, if I could, Isabella, because supposedly the LCBO sales skyrocketed, drug use skyrocketed, gambling skyrocketed, porn skyrocketed, people, divorces are up. People were thinking we were going to have a mini baby boom because people would love spending time with loved ones, and supposedly that didn't happen. Antidepressant use is up, depression is up. Therapists are saying that they're booked up. And I've heard from so many parents that their kids with remote learning are really struggling because they spend, all day on Zoom in classes, and then all night on electronic means as well, talking to friends or whatnot, that they're messed up with their times and they're depressed. And have we really come together, Isabel?
I think that there have been some challenges during the pandemic, and you've referenced some of them. But we can see in our work that United Way is doing in the community the importance of coming together and how the social connections have been able to provide supports where they're needed and uplift the community again where they're needed.
And I think part of it too, Brian, is I think we hear everything you've said, and that's what's dominating the headlines. And yet, behind the scenes at United Way, what we're seeing is a seniors tea group that got together in Peel region, trying to bring isolated seniors who were alone at home and just were going to share some tea virtually. It has grown exponentially through our Chinese Community Advisory Council, and now they're having discussions of how they might move that into our South Asian and Black Community Advisory Council as well. We've seen the cluster tables that we developed across Peel with hundreds of local agencies, from Knights Table to Eden to The Journey, all coming together, and then faith communities and associations also coming. And when our agencies put out a call for volunteers to go knocking on doors for COVID vaccine clinics, the overwhelming response for people is those are demonstrations to me that there is, in addition to all of the headlines you've commented on, there is also pent up desire to connect. And how do we harness that social capital? Part of it is telling a different story of what's happening in Peel as well, focusing on the strength of the social capital and then being deliberate with precision of how we're going to mitigate against it.
The Mississauga City Summit was really an attempt to bring Mississauga together and create social capital. I think the Toronto City Summit and Civic Action after tried to do the same thing in Toronto. I think the Toronto Region Board of Trade tries to bring the whole region together and build business social capital. Is the United Way of Toronto trying to do the same thing for all of Greater Toronto?
We are, as you know, the new United Way Greater Toronto, serving Peel, York Region, and Toronto, of course, is the largest funder of social services next to government. And yet we take great pride in being fiercely local. Our belief is that change happens at the pace of community and very local ways. And what happens in Brampton may not work in Ballantrae up in York Region or in Parkdale in Toronto. And so while we have a GTA network of agencies, our work is very local. And we believe it must stay so because we've got to respect the nuances. If we can network it and layer it together, great. But COVID has really taught us that we're going to move at the pace of community trust. And it's those residents who can help inform and mobilize in the best way. And so we'd like to continue on that fiercely local path, stitching a GTA story versus starting at the GTA level and trying to get into community.
Do you think people feel as connected to the United Way today when it's a Greater Toronto United Way versus a Peel United Way?
I would say, Brian, all of our fundraising, the outpouring of generosity, the community cluster tables that we've assembled, our partnership both with the federal government, the province, and the region would demonstrate that people are seeing us through our network of agencies in their neighborhood. And of course, there's always more work to do to be local. But I would say that we've been able to remain on the ground connected through a network of 280 plus agencies across the GTA. Over
280 agencies?
280 agencies that we support across the GTA. Over 150,000 donors across the GTA, and now close to 1,000 workplaces, civic, labor partners who in some way, shape, or form participate with United Way fundraising. And so it is in staying very connected, it is in staying granular at the social capital level and building trust that we remain present in communities like Peel.
We're chatting tonight about social capital, a study that the Toronto Greater Region, Toronto Board of Trade, United Way commissioned to study social capital in York, Peel, and Toronto, and released the results last week. It's a fascinating conversation. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back more in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight about social capital. Lots of you will know about financial capital and probably human capital, financial capital, and maybe even physical capital, which have been, the sources of capital that people have used to create businesses or create communities in the past. And about 2 or 3 decades ago, starting with a gentleman by the name of Robert Putnam in a book called Bowling Alone in America, and lots of other people, a term called social capital became studied to a great extent. And I was intrigued when the United Way of Toronto released a report last week talking about social capital in Toronto and Peel, and studied it. And studied it, Isabel, I guess prior to the pandemic, but you released it last week. Why did you want to do this study, Isabel?
Well, the study gives us insight into the strength of the networks that Daniela was just referring to. And so it gives us insight into the communities that we work in every day, and particularly where we need to take a more intentional focus. That may be through our investments and through some of our other work to decrease gaps in opportunities, and in this case, in opportunities to access social capital.
You were talking about how social capital is unevenly distributed. And there was a book I read a couple of years ago called, I think, The Great American City. It was about Chicago. And it was a study of social capital in different parts of Chicago. And it found that there was high degrees of social capital in upwardly mobile, high income areas. And there was generally low degrees of social capital in the lower income neighborhoods, other than there was high degrees of social capital within gangs and criminal organizations and things like that. So actually, social capital could have a positive as well as a negative impact. And then the other interesting thing was that they found that that today's people might utilize social capital in a different way than Robert Putnam's bowling or going to church or being part of a Rotary group. And it was things like being part of a protest or demonstration or a flea market or a farmer's market that may be different types of activity, but it was still civic activity. I wonder, what you think about that.
So the definition of social capital is broad. It isn't only participation in kind of those bowling groups that Putnam was referring to, or political groups or political affiliations. In fact, it is those kind of informal connections and relationships, whether that's going to a political protest with others who who are like-minded and who you can have that debate or dialogue with. That is actually core to social capital. It's all of the sort of human-to-human connections that we have, both, and Danielle spoke about this, both at the individual level, but also that influence and impact trust in institutions as well.
Why is it so much lower in low-income, non-upwardly mobile neighborhoods?
The research doesn't get too deeply, if at all, into the reasons of why. It really is just providing that baseline level. And so we do know that those with lower incomes and less financial security have less trust in neighbors. It may be connected to just opportunities to connect with their neighbors. And I don't know, Danielle, if you wanted to add anything to that as well.
Well, we've been, this is a story we've been saying, Brian, and you know United Way well from your decades of volunteering and leadership. We've been talking about poverty for decades. In Toronto, it started out with poverty by postal code, where we saw there was deepening, persistent, stubborn poverty in specific neighborhoods. Our more recent report, the Opportunity Equation, demonstrated, in fact, that deepening neighborhood poverty was spreading into the 905, particularly and dramatically into Peel. And so I think what we need to be clear about, if you just look at a young person growing up in a lower income community, looking for his or her first job, who are the neighbors they might reach out to? What network of jobs might those neighbors be able to connect that individual to? Will they trust them enough to make a connection and do that? Might that young person already participate in different associations or soccer clubs or recreational that give them access to? And so, to Isabel's point, while the report doesn't comment on that, we've been talking about poverty as the underlying factor in much of this. And this report says it's inextricably linked to social capital and trust. So everything we can do to build that more intentionally is critical for us to all collectively move forward. Because that young person in that neighborhood is eventually going to be working at one of the small businesses in Peel, or wanting to be a future leader. And are his or her opportunities as accessible as someone in a more affluent neighborhood?
So one of the things that the Great American City talked about was that if your parents tended to be involved, you tended to be involved. If your parents went to a blood donor clinic, you tended to go to a blood donor clinic. If your parents voted, you tended to vote. If your parents were part of Rotary, the probability that you would join a comparable club went up. So it's almost one of these things that you got to start young, and you got to give people social capital experiences when they're young, and then they'll practice it in the future. How do you do that?
I think we also, just a quick pursuit before Isabel jumps in with a thoughtful, we've also got to get rid of, Brian, any systemic and structural issues that do not allow people to participate. And so if it's easy to say if your parents participate, but as a young Italian Canadian kid growing up in North York, both of my parents working 2 jobs, hell, they didn't have time to worry about me, let alone volunteer and model for me, Daniele, you should be volunteering. And some of that is structural, because if you're working in 2 precarious jobs just to pay a basement apartment that you're sharing with 3 other families, your ability to model that and do what you might naturally do is very limited by other systemic issues: access to childcare, access to good jobs, paid sick leave, good affordable housing. And these are all things that you talked about at the Mississauga Summit. And so we're back to We've got to be able to address social trust. Part of that is addressing underlying root systemic structural barriers that exist.
Okay, so but Daniele, if you had two parents that were working two jobs and didn't have time to expose you to that, how did you become involved? What was it that got you the social capital? What was it? Was it a mentor? Was it a school teacher? What was it that got you involved in the community?
Excellent
Such that now
question.
you're president and CEO of probably the largest voluntary organization in Canada.
Excellent question. And I wish it would, and I wish I could say, friend, that it was exclusively my hard work, but it was also a series of born as a white male in a family that in the 1970s had opportunity to move slightly further up the middle income ladder while they were working, able to put down a small down payment on a home, able to surround myself in a neighborhood of mixed, there was a few Italians, a mix of different cultural groups. And when I was looking for my first job, it was actually a neighbor who said, well, you might want to do a resume and maybe I can help you connect to your first job. Somebody who first told me, hey, instead of going to work at the factory with your dad, maybe you should think about going to university. And here's how you apply. And so it is a mixed network of people that gave me an opportunity. Not all individuals have those opportunities intentionally in front of them. Mine was kind of haphazard, Brian. I think we need to be intentional if we want to move people up what is a much different social mobility ladder today than it was in 1970 when I was growing up. Daniele, being born today in similar circumstance, may not emerge to be the CEO of United Way Greater Toronto.
So a year ago, we had anti-Black racism issues across North America because of what was going on in Minneapolis, St. Paul. I interviewed numerous different people, and they said that there was sort of institutionalized keeping you down within the guidance system in a lot of schools in economically poor neighborhoods. And it wasn't just racially based, it was income based. If your parents had a poor education and a poor income, that the guidance counselor sort of streamed you away from university and striving too hard and streamed you into that factory job. And it wasn't just race, it was income oriented, according to a lot of the people I interviewed. Is that a problem? Is that we need to have those teachers and those educators and those guidance people and those ministers and those pastors and those priests that can encourage people to be more upwardly mobile?
I think there's examples. It reminds me, Brian, of the FACES report that was issued in Peel by United Way years ago that documented that Black youth were not graduating from high school at the same trend line and percentage that other youth were. And as a result, a group of parents, agencies, the school board, teachers got together and created what is now an intentional Black student success initiative that is in fact rolling out in Peel, where we are wrapping individuals with support and ensuring that we can monitor our more Black youth graduating. So I think there are opportunities, there are a lot of examples in Peel and across the GTA of people coming together to address what might be systemic and structural issues that are built into all of our organizations. And it takes research like the FACES report to document that and then bring people together. And our hope is that this report will also act as a catalyst for intentional and thoughtful work in those communities where social capital is lacking or not as accessible as in others.
One of the other things that came out of that book that I was referencing earlier was that for really good social capital, you had to get past involvement and get to engagement. And that there was this critical step, and it's comparable to the language that people talk about a lot in diversity, that diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice, that you've really got to listen to people and engage them. You can't just invite them to the party. You've got to actually party with them. You can't just invite them to dance. You got to dance with them. What are we doing to make sure that people are actually engaged in our communities, engaged in the United Way, engaged into those 250 organizations that you mentioned?
Well, I think we've got examples in partnerships that, when I think about the range of partnerships we've got across the region with both the regional government and each of the municipal governments, when I think about the range of our partnerships with the police and then our network of agencies, I think we are using an engagement model as the starting point. Finding ways for people not only to get involved as a transactional, but that it becomes a norm and that we keep them. But that means, I think, as you referenced earlier, listening to their voice. So when we bring them, individuals with lived experience, into the Peel Poverty Reduction Committee, the only poverty reduction table across the province that has an entire table for people with lived experience. We are basing all of our policy, all of our research, all of our practice decisions at that Peel table on the lived experience of those in poverty in Peel. If we could use that as a template, when we're building communities, when we're adding community centers, when we're looking at subdivisions, are we talking to those people in those neighborhoods? When we're planning programs at United Way, are we talking to residents from those neighborhoods to talk about what they need and what their aspirations are? And so it's a bit of a mind shift, Brian. You're only going to get people to come out once, because if you don't listen to them, they're going to not come back again. Exactly. And so how do you build this not as a checklist, but as a regular engagement process of starting with people and not the process?
You know, I'm a little bit of a political hack. You may not know. Some of my listeners probably know. But it's interesting. You take a look at what the Obama campaign did and some of the books that have written about that Obama campaign. One of their keys was taking those $5, $10, $25 donations. And their rationale was, once people had invested even a small amount of money, they were engaged. They were committed. They then gave more money. The probability of going out and voting went up, because the last thing they wanted to do is to invest some money and see that the person they gave some money to lose. And so, I always thought the UNICEF, collecting pennies was a great way to get kids involved in a small way, and charities and donating and part of an organization. You got to go out and get that $1, $5, $25 donations.
Because when you do, you've got a greater likelihood of them becoming chronic serial volunteers and real champions for the community. And you see the faces all the time. The challenge now for Peel, the challenge from this report is, can we individually, organizationally, and then collectively be more intentional and build social capital in those neighborhoods? And can we then look 5 years hence to say we're moving the needle? This will be, I think, the pressure for us collectively.
We're chatting tonight about social capital in Peel, in York, in Toronto, with members of the United Way of Greater Toronto. Daniele Zanotti, who is the president and CEO, Isabel Cancanti, who is the director of research, and Dina Dora, who is the manager of media and communications. We're going to take a last short break, come back with some concluding comments in just a minute. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting, I think, a really interesting conversation about social capital, which Daniele Zanotti, who is the president and CEO of the United Way, says it's the next big thing for Peel and York and Toronto to make sure they do. And we got to invest in. It's interesting. About a decade ago, I was fascinated. Both the provincial government as well as the Obama administration in the United States, coming out of the Great Recession, said we have to get people, goods, and ideas moving again. And people is an investment in human capital, and goods is an investment in physical capital, and ideas is the only way you get ideas going is through social capital. So coming out of the Great Recession, we admitted that social capital was critically important. So Daniele and Isabel, how do we get social capital? How do we get ideas moving again in the Greater Toronto Area?
Part of it is creating space for those ideas, creating space to bring people together, creating space for dialogue. I think what Daniele referenced earlier around those structural barriers, working collectively to break down those structural barriers is so critical to the social capital work and social capital building across the region.
Giving people spaces.
I think the other part, Brian, is COVID has demonstrated that there's work that government can and must do. There's work that businesses can and must do. There's work that agencies can and must do. But then there is work that only community can do. And what this demonstrates for me is decades of work in this field that, yes, we need to fundraise. Yes, we need social services and charity. But the single most sustainable way for us to address issues in Peel, emerging, stubborn, for some maybe invisible issues in Peel, is to build civic muscle. And that's not the person next to you, or it's the person who's not listening to the Brian Crombie podcast show. It's actually you. And so each of us has got to get agency into this. And we hope it is then contagious in a good way, that it spreads, that by me getting involved, others join. But I have become more obsessed that civic muscle, or this building of social capital, as it's called in the report, is the critical ingredient for us to be individually and collectively healthier, more productive, and safer as we go forward.
We're chatting tonight with Daniele Zanatti. He's the president and CEO of the United Way of Greater Toronto. Isabel Cancanti, who is the director of research, and Dina Dorada, who is the manager of media and communications, about social capital and a report they came out with. Dina or somebody, could you tell me if people want to get a copy of this report, is there a website that they can go to?
Absolutely, unitedwaygt.org.
Excellent.
This research and past research, and also donate there as well.
And if people want to get involved in United Way, same website?
Yes, that's right. unitedwaygt.org.
Awesome. Well, I got to end this by telling you that one of the best descriptions I had of social capital and in fact success in life and business and communities, etc., was the tree. And that, you got to have roots, and those roots give you the resources you need. And those resources are physical resources. They're monetary capital resources, financial capital. They're your roots back to your home countries, your roots back to your ethnic group, your roots back to whatever that group is that you rely on. And then you grow strong on your own. In your trunk, and that's got to be your human capital. You got to get a good education. You got to know what you're doing in your job. You got to be strong in your trunk. But then to really flourish, you got to branch out. And the way to branch out is to have social capital and branch out and meet other people and branch out to other people, other societies, other demographics, other job descriptions, other communities, etc. And it's that bridging, that branching out that allows you to flourish. And I think if you have the roots, and if you have the strong trunk, human capital, and if you have those branching out roots, social capital, you'll end up being successful. So maybe you'll put that on the front of your report next time. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. That's the Brian Crombie Radio Hour tonight. I'm on every night, 6 o'clock on Saga 960 AM. You can get all my podcasts and videocasts on briancrombie.com, and videos on YouTube and Facebook, and podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Audible Podcasts, Speakeasy, and anywhere good podcasts are available. Daniele, Isabel, and Dina, thanks for joining me. Good night, everybody.